On Christmas Eve, before I even had time to pull out my chair, my son-in-law, the man who just days earlier had set up a trap to let me freeze to death in the woods, stood up, raised his glass, and said loudly, "A toast to Samuel. One fall is enough for the old man to learn his lesson." The whole room burst into laughter, and I, with 3 broken ribs, purple marks around my neck, and the memory of the night he tried to squeeze the breath out of me, only smiled back. No one knew I had seen the saw marks on the staircase. No one knew he had cut the cabin's phone line. No one knew he had prepared an insurance form forged with my signature, and absolutely no one knew. I did not die because they had not heard the truth yet. If you have ever been seen as weak, ever been dismissed to the point they thought you could not stand back up, or ever survived the hands of the very person you once loved most, sit down. You are about to hear the story of how a 66-year-old man tore the mask off the person who wanted to kill him right in the middle of a Christmas Eve dinner, and made an entire room hold its breath for the second time. I always thought my glass furnace, the place where molten sand flowed into light, was the safest place in the world. That flame helped me get through the 2 long years after Marianne died, helped me survive the cold loft on Capitol Hill people called Pierce Glass Studio. But that Christmas Eve, under the shimmering lights, I had blown myself at the long oak table polished smooth. I felt something different, the dull ache of 3 broken ribs, and an intentional humiliation. I placed my hand on the chair, took a short breath. Short, because every attempt to inhale deeply sent a sharp line of pain across my chest, as if a shard of glass had just snapped inside me. As I sat, my breathing blended with the faint ringing of the amber glass chandelier above, its soft but sharp light revealing every crease on the guests' faces. People always praised my lamps, but tonight they reflected something more warped, a room waiting for someone to throw the first spark. Darren stood up. I heard the wooden chair scrape across the floor. Dry and impatient, he lifted a glass of red wine, his hand wearing a shiny new watch, a piece far too expensive for the real salary of a man drowning in debt, but talented at pretending otherwise. The flame from the small glass furnace in the corner flickered over his face, sharpening his smile like the edge of a glass cutter. A toast to Samuel, still tough even after that fall at Cedar Lake Cabin. He paused for a beat, letting his eyes sweep the table to make sure everyone heard him. Guess the old man finally learned his lesson. The phrase "the old man" left his mouth just loud enough, just clear enough for everyone to understand. My heart still beat, but he wanted this table to see me as a clumsy, pitiful, aging fool, someone who fell down the stairs because of age, no longer steady on his own legs. A few people offered awkward smiles. They did not know how to react. The Pierce relatives stiffened, eyes shifting toward me, then away. The couple by the window nodded politely, trying not to show discomfort. The young glass apprentice, Lucas, stared into his drink, his hand trembling as if he feared dropping it. Angela, Elena's friend from the hospital, pressed her lips together and set down her fork. I saw all of it. Only Elena did not smile. She gripped her napkin so tightly her fingertips turned pale, but she forced herself to stay calm because, truthfully, she was not yet strong enough to face the fact that the man she once called her husband was using that very voice to humiliate her father at dinner. I looked at Darren and gave a very faint smile, so faint that someone who did not know me might think I was laughing off my fall, but Elena knew. I saw her shake her head slightly, eyes shimmering. I raised my glass, my hand trembling from the pain stabbing through my ribs. "Thank you, Darren," I said quietly. "You are too kind." I did not lift the glass to drink. I set it down slowly. The clink against the oak echoed clearly. A small sound, but in a room full of glass and bright lights, it felt sharp as a hammer, striking hot metal. I felt every gaze turned toward me. A thin line of cold air crawled down my spine. Darren tilted his head. "You're not going to explain anything? Or are you still too sore from the fall?" The word fall was pushed out like a knife twist. The pain that surged in my chest then was not from my ribs. It was from the memory of 3 weeks earlier. The night Cedar Lake was so cold, my breath turned to white fog, and I realized the step had not rotted, but had been sawed halfway through. I braced my hand on the table, leaned forward slightly, and whispered, just loudly enough for the whole table to hear, I did not fall. I saw Darren freeze, only half a second, but I had spent a lifetime reading eyes, the eyes of liars, of hiders, of people willing to push someone off a cliff for a handful of money. I held his gaze, unblinking. Then I said the line no one at the table expected, and I did not survive because of luck. Angela stopped breathing. Lucas shrank back. A child at the far end dropped a spoon, the metal clattering softly against the plate. I tilted my head and gave a thin smile, the kind Marianne, my late wife, used to call the smile you wear when you know something others don't. Let me tell you what happened 3 weeks ago. The room fell into silence, a silence thick as glass that has not fully cooled, clear but ready to crack at any second, and I began to speak. I was not born to be an artist. At least that is what I believed for half my life. I was just a craftsman, a man who worked with fire, hot glass, and heavy steel tools. The only thing I had, and could be proud of, was a pair of hands that had never betrayed me in 36 years. People called me the old man who blows light on Lake Union. The name sounded far too grand, but perhaps it was because I often worked at dusk. When the sun sank into the water, the light shining through the glass I was shaping made everything sparkle, as if the whole room were lit from within. The furnace in the studio crackled. Blue flames curled around each glowing block of glass, and I stood in the middle of the heat and the patches of light, as if I were speaking with them. Pierce Glass Studio was not large, but it was my whole life, and it was also the place that witnessed the last 2 years of the woman I loved most, Marianne. Even thinking her name makes my chest tighten a little. Not the way broken ribs hurt, but the way something real aches when its Chow is gone. We met when I was 29. She came to buy a chandelier for her living room and stood watching me blow glass for nearly 30 minutes, forgetting to get her wallet from the car. She said the firelight on my face made me look older than my age, but steady. I laughed and told her that if those words fell into the ears of a gullible man, he would think he was a genius. And yet I believed her. I believed in her, and I never regretted it. Marianne loved the ocean, loved the color blue, loved early mornings with a thin layer of mist hovering over the lake. When she died of cancer 2 years ago, I lost the ability to sleep in the dark. Every night after the funeral, I sat in the studio, my hand resting on the sea blue glass vase I had blown on her last birthday. She smiled when she saw it in the afternoon light and said, "It looks like the water at Cedar Lake, Sam." I placed that vase on the highest shelf where the morning light touched it, as if she were still there, still watching me work, still gently correcting the tiny mistakes I often overlooked. Elena, our only daughter, was the most beautiful part of Marianne left in this world. She had her mother's blue eyes, but my temperament, calm, patient, sometimes too willing to endure. A nurse at Swedish Medical Center, she lived for others to the point of forgetting herself. I always feared that her kindness was the easiest thing in the world to exploit, and that turned out to be true. Darren Holt stepped into Elena's life 6 years ago. I remember it clearly. He showed up in a fitted suit, shiny shoes, and a voice that always sounded like he had just walked out of a real estate presentation. He called himself a developer, but I suspected his real job was using loans from one project to patch the holes of another. Elena loved him in the way only a hopeful young woman can, fully and without defense. And I saw the hollowness behind his smile the first time we shook hands. But my daughter was happy. After 2 years of losing Marianne, I could not bring myself to destroy the little joy she had. I stayed silent. That was my mistake. A silence I would pay for later. Marianne and I once had a small dream. to fix up Cedar Lake Cabin at Snoqualmie Pass, between pine forests and snowy cliffs. We wanted to turn it into a second studio, a place to blow glass in silence, without cars, without customers, without deadlines, just us and the sound of wind sweeping across the lake. But illness took up our time before we could do anything. Cedar Lake Cabin remained like an unfinished notebook. After Marianne's funeral, I did not return. I did not have the strength. I did not have the courage. Until the day Elena called, inviting me to the cabin, to breathe a little of Mom's air again. And I agreed, not realizing I was walking into what would almost become the last place of my life. 36 years working with glass taught me many things outsiders think only police would know. I understand load points. I know where things are weakest. I know how cracks spread. I know when a surface will shatter from the slightest touch. To others, a rotten step might look like an accident. But to me, the man who reads every fracture, a piece of wood that has been sawed, is entirely different. I knew the moment I stepped on that stair at Cedar Lake Cabin 3 weeks ago. The truth is, in any material, glass, wood, metal, a deliberate cut always leaves a sign, no matter how well someone tries to hide it. Darren did not know that. He thought a thin layer of snow would be enough to cover it. He thought I was just a lonely old man, naive, no longer sharp. He forgot that I am Samuel Pierce, a man who spent his whole life watching for the smallest crack to keep a creation from breaking. But Elena, my poor girl, she had no idea. She only wanted a warm weekend at the cabin her mother once loved. She did not know that Darren, the man she gave her heart to, had spent the days before calculating whether, when I fell, my neck would snap instantly, or whether he should let the cold finish the job. If Marianne were alive, she would have seen Darren's eyes in a heartbeat. She always saw through people. I was the foolish one, or perhaps just too lonely after she died. And that is why I must tell all of it. Not to take revenge on Darren, but to remind myself that a crack, if unseen, will spread and destroy the entire structure. In glass, yes. In people, yes. And in a family, most of all. That morning I was standing in the studio with a glowing red block of glass on the end of the blowpipe, the fire reflecting on the wall in blurred streaks, like old fragments of memory. My phone vibrated 3 times inside my apron pocket, the pattern Elena always used when she wanted me to answer immediately. Her voice came through clear, but with something tired in it, like the sound of winter wind passing through the pine trees north of Lake Union. Dad, are you free this week? I want you to come up to Cedar Lake Cabin with me. I'll make Mom's winter stew. I froze. For 1.5 years since the day Marianne died, Elena had never mentioned that dish again. It was my wife's special dish, the one that filled the kitchen with cinnamon and thyme, the one she always cooked on thick snow days. You want to go up to the cabin? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. On the other end, Elena gave a soft laugh. I know you've avoided that place since Mom passed, but I think it's time. I want you to breathe some of Mom's air again. I didn't answer right away, not because I hesitated about going, but because the way she said it revealed a tiny scratch in her voice, a kind of uncertainty, a slightly off note that only someone who'd listened to his child for decades would notice. She added quickly, as if to cover the silence, Dad, you'll go first with Darren. I got called in for another shift, but I'll drive up after I'm done. I don't want you waiting. I heard the words, don't want you waiting, but what I really heard was, you don't want me going with both you and Darren at the same time. A crack, small, but real. I asked, are you sure everything's ready at the cabin? It's cold this time of year. Elena answered immediately, too quickly. Darren said he already turned on the heating remotely. The cabin's warm. You just need to go. It felt strange. Darren, the man who always mocked the cabin as too rustic, like a horror movie, Not enough signal for work. Suddenly turned on the heating? Since when did he care about anything that didn't make him money? But Elena was trying so hard, and How could I refuse Marianne's daughter? I wiped my hands on an old cotton towel, standing in the smell of fire and glass, and said, "All right, I'll go." Elena exhaled, clearly relieved, the soundlight like someone setting down a hidden burden. "Thank you, Dad. Get ready. Darren will pick you up at 2. Something in her voice made me uneasy, a vague feeling like when I picked up a freshly blown piece and sensed a spot slightly wrong, slightly weak, slightly off, even when it looked perfect on the outside. I hung up and stood there for a long moment, staring through the studio's big window. Outside, Seattle was soaked in the familiar gray of December. The surface of Lake Union lay flat as a mirror, with only a few boats rocking softly. I thought of Marianne, thought of how she sat by the cabin window, legs wrapped in her hand-woven blue blanket, eyes drifting toward the lake with little white foam spots. Thought of how she laughed and said we would repair the cabin and make it our second glass-blowing studio, a peaceful place for old age. Then I thought of the day she died. That cabin was no longer a place to return to. It felt like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. But Elena wanted to open that door, and I had to try for her. I shut off the furnace. The blue flame curled in on itself, then vanished, leaving darkness spreading across the room. The familiar sound of cooling glass chimed in tiny ting notes, like metal growing cold. I walked out and locked the studio with the old key I'd kept since 1991. When the door closed behind me, a gust of wind blew through the corridor, carrying Seattle's cold rain smell with it. The last glow of the furnace still lingered in my eyes, but ahead was only darkness. I didn't know, or didn't want to know, that I had just locked away not only the studio, but the last bit of peace I had. 3 weeks ago, I was still a lonely but safe man, and from the moment I agreed to go to Cedar Lake Cabin, my fate began sliding down a cold slope, toward a trap that a younger man, the one I once called my son-in-law, had prepared, thinking I would never escape it. Darren arrived exactly at 2 in the afternoon, the engine of his new generation Ford Bronco roaring in front of the studio door as if announcing his presence on purpose. I locked the door, pulled my coat collar up for warmth, and stepped outside. The cold air from Elliott Bay cut across Capitol Hill and hit my face, sharp as a knife. Darren lowered the window, flashing a smile so wide I could see his entire lower row of teeth, but his eyes didn't follow the smile. "Elena got called in," he said the moment I shut the car door. "Mass trauma night, lots of accidents. She can't leave." He said it so smoothly I knew he had rehearsed. I nodded, buckled my seatbelt, and noticed his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly the knuckles were turning white. The Bronco rolled forward, merging into the heavy traffic leaving Seattle heading east. I didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. I only listened to Darren's breathing, the sound of the wipers scraping water off the windshield, the way he kept glancing at the rearview mirror as if waiting for someone to follow. I had driven many people in my life, artists, museum curators, major collectors, young glassblowers, people whose way of holding an object alone told me whether they were confident or nervous. Darren was nervous, so nervous he couldn't hide it. We had just passed Issaquah when he cleared his throat, his voice shifting into that artificially friendly tone he always used when trying to sell something. "Sam, I have an opportunity I think you'll like." I didn't respond. He took that as permission to continue. "A commercial lot in Tacoma. Prime location. I'm planning to turn it into a mixed-use complex. Storefronts below, luxury apartments above. The market's rising. If you invest early, the profit could triple, even quadruple." I turned to look at him without saying anything. Darren swallowed and dropped the bomb. "I need about $250,000 to close the deal." He said the words 250 as lightly as if he were asking to borrow a drill. I didn't react right away. I simply watched him, watched the way his hand slipped off the wheel for half a second before, scrambling back. He forgot one thing. I wasn't just some old man who blew glass. In 36 years working with major galleries, curators, collectors, and artists, I had met every type of person. Those pitching investments, those selling opportunities, those using pretty words to hide bottomless financial holes. I knew the smell of a scam the way I knew the smell of hot glass. Even if he sprinkled sugar on top, I could still smell the burn. I asked directly, my voice just loud enough to rise over the rain. "Why me?" Darren inhaled, eyes fixed on the road. "Because you're family, and because you have capital. I think it's time you got involved in something bigger than those glass lamps." He didn't know that last line, "those glass lamps," was exactly what made me understand him. Someone who doesn't respect another person's craft will never respect that person. I pressed my lips together and asked the one question he couldn't rehearse. "If it's such a good opportunity, why don't you take out a loan?" The Bronco drifted slightly to the right. Darren corrected the wheel quickly and said curtly, "The timing's tight. Loan paperwork takes too long." I looked at him. A man who lies will always speak too fast or too little. Darren was the first type. He talked non-stop, like a drowning man grabbing at any branch within reach. "This is the kickoff for you and Elena's future, Sam. 250,000 now. A few years later, it'll be 1 million. I guarantee it." I turned back to the road ahead. Tall pines, black as ink on both sides, mist rolling low across the pavement, the Bronco moving faster than necessary. Darren kept checking the mirror, as if afraid of being followed, as if guilty, as if hoping I would sign a check to lift him out of the hole he had dug himself. I breathed out slowly, the dull ache in my left rib, reminding me I was in a car with someone who could be dangerous. A feeling I hadn't had in years, not since Marianne died. "I'll think about it," I said, nothing more. Darren forced a stiff smile, the smile of someone hearing an answer he didn't want. "Just remember, this opportunity won't wait long." I didn't respond. I was too busy thinking about something more important. Elena wasn't there. The cabin was cold, like it had been abandoned. Darren was behaving strangely, driving too fast, talking too much and too urgently, and an investment request for $250,000 appeared exactly when my family was heading to the cabin. A part of me began to realize some things didn't match, but I couldn't piece them together yet. Not then. Not when the Bronco was plunging into the white fog of Snoqualmie Pass, and my instinct, the instinct that had saved me from countless mistakes, began to throb like a crack spreading across glass. We arrived at Cedar Lake Cabin just as dusk settled in, that pale purple light unique to Snoqualmie Pass stretching across the snow like a coat of cold paint. Darren turned off the car and said in a tone that sounded casually confident, "See? The cabin's probably warm already." But the moment I opened the door and stepped out, the cold slapped my face like a thin blade, so sharp it made my lungs tighten. There was no sign the heater had been on, no warmth seeping through the door cracks, no hum of machinery, not the slightest sense of heat a cabin left running for hours should have. I opened the front door. A wave of icy air rushed straight into me, forcing me to hold my breath for a few seconds. The cabin was pitch dark, smelled of cold wood left untouched for too long, and a thin layer of dust on the shelves proved no one had prepared anything. Darren slipped past me and flipped the switch. He laughed lightly, trying to act as if everything was normal. Must have shut off on its own. I'll check it tomorrow." But I knew this cabin better than he did. Marianne and I had spent an entire afternoon choosing the most stable heater type for sub-zero winters, the kind that rarely shuts off accidentally. There was no reason for it to stop, unless it had never been turned on. I didn't answer. I simply walked inside, removed my coat, and said I would go get firewood for the fireplace. Darren said, "Let me do it." I ignored him. I needed to breathe. Needed a moment of quiet to sort through everything that had been pressing on my mind since the car ride. I walked around to the back of the cabin. The snowfall was light, only a thin layer covering the wooden steps that led down to the woodpile. My boots crushed the snow with a dry, heavy sound. The faint light from the cabin window was just enough for me to see that the first step was fine. I stepped onto the first step, then stopped as soon as my foot touched the second. A tiny sound cracked through the air, not the sound of rotten wood, but the sound of something deliberately weakened. I crouched down. Cold air hit my face. I brushed aside the thin layer of snow covering the surface, and I saw it, a sharp, deep cut running across the step, slicing through nearly 80% of the wood's thickness. I touched it with my finger. The edge was still crisp, still showing the clean bite of a saw. There was no mistaking it. I had worked with wood for more than 30 years, not as much as glass, but enough to know the difference between rot and a fresh cut. This was fresh enough that the sawdust still held its scent. I looked down. In the snow, a few steps away from the stairs, were footprints. Not mine, not Elena's. They were Darren's, the wolf-tooth pattern of the boots he had been wearing all afternoon, impossible to confuse with anything else. I stood still for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5. Not because of the cold, but because my heart was tightening, like someone was squeezing it from both sides. A truth slammed into me. This wasn't an accident, not a mishap, not weather damage. This was a trap waiting for the exact moment I put my full weight on this step, so it would snap, so I would fall onto the frozen ground below from a height of about 2 meters, a fall that could snap a neck, or at the very least, leave me unable to stand again. A thin layer of snow was enough to hide the saw mark. Someone assumed I wouldn't question anything. Someone assumed I would step onto this stair out of a harmless routine. Someone, that person inside the cabin right now, the one who just smiled at me, the one who lied about the heater, the one who tried to pitch an investment of $250,000. I stepped back, my heartbeat pounding in my chest like frozen knocks. In that moment, every instinct from the car ride, Darren's constant mirror checking, his strained voice when mentioning Elena, his unusual urgency, snapped together into a terrifyingly complete picture. I understood everything, and what I understood wasn't that the cabin was cold or the step was weak. It was this: Darren wanted me dead. He didn't just want to borrow money. He wasn't just desperate. He was calculating enough to saw through a stair, calculating enough to look me in the eyes earlier and say, "The heater's on." My instinct, the same instinct that had saved me from countless glass-blowing dangers, from overheated furnaces to pieces cracking under pressure, spoke clearer than ever. Don't trust him. Don't turn your back. Don't let him know you found out. I stood there for a moment, my breath turning into white smoke in the air. Then I walked back toward the cabin, slow steps, keeping every expression as normal as possible. But inside me, another kind of cold, one not born of snow or wind, was crawling up my spine. The cold of truth I no longer suspected. I was in real danger. I stood before the sawn-through step, my breath turning into white smoke in the cold air of Snoqualmie Pass. And the first thing I did was not panic or go back to the cabin to confront Darren. The first thing I did was observe. Observe the way a glassworker observes a crack on a vessel about to break. I crouched down and ran 2 fingers gently along the cut. The wood was still sharp, the edges slightly rough, but without signs of weathering, proving the saw blade was not too old. This was the cut of a medium sawtooth blade, not a fine-tooth blade used for hardwood, but the common kind sold in any repair store. A regular wood saw always leaves tiny vibration lines on the surface, and just as I expected, when I tilted the wood toward the light cast from the cabin, I saw evenly spaced lines, proving the cutter was not a professional, but not clumsy enough to hack at it wildly. It took the person about 5 or 6 minutes to reach this depth. I examined the angle of the cut, slightly slanted downward. which meant he stood on the upper step, cutting downward, not below, cutting upward. That matched the boot prints I saw in the snow. Darren stood exactly there when I went behind the cabin. If it had been a real accident, rotten wood would break in random patterns, and the core would be dark and spongy. But this was an intentional cut, a deliberate cut. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and let the white beam shine directly on the cut. Tiny wood fibers, still clinging to the edge, reflected light into the camera. I activated the timestamp and photographed every angle, every footprint, every centimeter of the step. I photographed Darren's boot print, the wolf tooth pattern of the soles he had worn the entire trip. I filmed a short video to record the vibration when I tapped the wood's edge lightly. Then I stood up, letting the cold flood my lungs to keep myself sharp. I was not allowed to panic yet. Panic would make me do something wrong, and one wrong step in a situation like this could be the last. I walked back into the cabin, keeping my stride as normal as possible, not letting Darren, if he was watching, see that I knew. The moment I stepped inside, I sensed the second irregularity. The phone cord behind the wooden table by the window was no longer connected to the jack. I knelt, pulled aside Marianne's old curtain. The cord was cut, not slipped out. Cut, and not cut with a sharp knife. The frayed edge proved the same saw blade had been used to do it quickly. I took photos, zoomed in on the cut, and took photos of the disconnected outlet. Then I stood and moved to the back door, where Darren had gone to the shed. The shed lock had 2 parallel scratches, the kind left when someone tries to pry it open quickly with a tool of the wrong size. I ran a finger over it. The scraped metal was fresh, no oxidation, meaning it had been made within a day. I took more photos. In the phone screen, the scratch marks showed clearly under the cabin's cold light. Lifeless evidence, but evidence that told the truth more precisely than any testimony. When I turned off the camera, a sharp pain struck the left side of my chest, delivering the answer clearly. Darren did not just want me to fall. He wanted me to fall when I could not call for help, could not call Elena, could not call anyone, to fall into an icy cabin nearly 30 minutes from town, with enough frost to stiffen my body before anyone could find me. This was not a burst of anger, not an accidental scuffle. This was a script, a play prepared with a saw, with cold, with distance, and with a heating system he had never turned on. A perfect accident. If I died here, no one would question it. A 66-year-old man slipping on a rotten wooden step at his family cabin. Reasonable, natural. No one would have a reason to investigate further. Everyone would believe it, except me, because I look at the cut, the wood, the vibration, the boot prints, and they all say the same thing. Darren wanted me dead, and he prepared for it more carefully than I ever imagined. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the wind scraping against the cabin roof, hearing the silence of the forest wrap around me like thick glass. A regular person might not notice the difference between naturally cracked wood and manipulated wood, but I, the man who spent his life reading cracks, could not mistake it. This cabin had just spoken, and what it said was, "Do not misstep by even an inch." When Darren said he would run into town for a bit to grab more supplies, I simply nodded, trying to keep the calm demeanor of an old man on a cabin retreat. But the moment the sound of his Ford Bronco disappeared behind the snow-covered trees, I counted exactly 20 seconds and then quickly stepped into the small bedroom where he had left his backpack. I once taught Elena, don't go through someone's belongings unless you are ready to see the truth. And today, I had to swallow that very lesson. I opened the zipper of Darren's bag. The smell of cheap cologne mixed with damp paper rose. The scent of someone drowning in debt. The first layer held shirts, jeans, and a box of vitamins meant to fake good health. But on the second layer, I saw it. A thick stack of documents clipped inside a clear plastic folder. I pulled it out. On the very first page, printed in bold, cold black letters, notice of foreclosure, Tacoma commercial lot. Amount due, $500,000. I read slowly, each line stabbing into my eyes. Darren borrowed about $500,000 for a commercial lot in Tacoma. Balloon interest, matured 6 months ago. I turned to the second page. A pile of receipts from the Muckleshoot Casino. All cash advances, each withdrawal $10,000, $15,000, $7,500, totaling over $310,000. Darren Holt's signature was on each slip, his hand shaking so badly the signature wobbled and smeared. Page 3. Collection of letters from 3 different agencies. One of them stated bluntly, "Final attempt before legal action." I swallowed hard, but the thing that chilled me was not the debt. It was the stack behind it. A life insurance packet, mine, the one I believed listed Elena as the sole beneficiary after Marianne died. But here, right in front of me, was a beneficiary change form naming beneficiary Darren Holt. The signature on the line, Samuel Pierce, made me stop breathing for 2 full seconds. It looked like mine, but it wasn't. The slant was different. The pen pressure was different. The final downward stroke dipped too deep. I have never written that way. I looked at the effective date, 6 months ago, right when Darren started helping manage my online bills, right when he said, "Let me set payment reminders for you," right when I gave him access to my secondary email, thinking my son-in-law was trying to help keep the household organized. I turned to the next page. Medical information forms, all. My signatures, scanned and pasted onto new versions. Whoever forged them knew what they were doing, or had guidance. And then I saw the final thing in the folder, a silver USB stick, the kind banks use for scanned documents. I plugged it into the cabin laptop, the one I kept there for editing photos of my glasswork, and a series of files appeared. Pierce, insurance, update, PDF. Beneficiary transfer, signed scan.png, Tacoma lot contract final, Holt debt summary SX. Darren had saved every incriminating document on one USB because he needed them for his financial lawyer, or more accurately, to prove he was entitled to collect the insurance money when I died. I opened the insurance summary file. The payout if I died, $800,000. A blunt number. A number large enough to pull Darren out of debt, erase the Tacoma lot, clear every cash advance, and still leave him with a few $100,000 to take care of Elena. The exact phrase he once said in my living room. "If anything happens to you, I'll always look after Elena." That day I thought he was just being polite. Now I understood he meant it literally. I closed the folder, my fingers trembling with a mix of anger and a hollow ache I could not name. Not because of the money, not because of the fraud, but because the man plotting to kill me was the man Elena trusted completely. I looked around the cabin for a long moment, the place where Marianne once laughed, once dried her hair by the fireplace, once placed her blue glass vase on the shelf, and it felt as if someone was trying to erase everything she left behind. I put everything back exactly where it had been, zipped the bag, and placed it in the exact corner by the bed, as before. No trace, no extra crease. Then I stood in the middle of the room, looked out the window at the thick, dark forest, and understood the final truth. The truth every piece of evidence had just thrown in my face. Darren was not just desperate. He had a plan to kill me for $800,000 of insurance money. When Darren returned to the cabin, after darkness had swallowed nearly the entire pine forest, the headlights of his truck sliced a long blade of light across the frozen face of Cedar Lake, and I sat by the fireplace pretending to read. He opened the door, cold wind rushing in behind him, and the smile on his face looked so strained it seemed the mask was about to crack. "I picked up more supplies," he said, dropping his bag, his eyes flicking quickly around the cabin to see if anything was out of place. I answered gently, "Darren, about the investment, I think I want more details." His smile froze. "What details?" "Real documents, deeds, contracts. I want to see them." His face changed color instantly, as if I had kicked out the last brick in the wall he was hiding behind. "What are you implying, Samuel?" "Nothing. Only that you're $500,000 lot." He cut me off with a voice sharp as shattered glass. "What the hell do you know about investing? You're just an old glassblower living on luck. You couldn't save your wife from dying, but you want to teach me how to make money?" That sentence hit me harder than any punch could. My ears rang for a second. Marianne, the woman whose hand I held until her last breath, was dragged out by him as a weapon to shame me. But I stayed calm. "Say whatever you want, but don't bring my wife into it." Darren laughed, a dry and frightening sound. "If she were alive, she'd tell you not to make trouble. Because right now, you're making things difficult for me." He stepped closer, another step. Then the punch slammed into my chest. Fast, hard, and without warning. I heard a heavy crack, like wood snapping. The pain shot across my chest so sharply I knew immediately. This was no ordinary hit. Having lived through 2 chest injuries when I was younger, I recognized the feeling at once. A rib had broken. Air shot out of my lungs. Pain so sharp my vision dimmed. I tried to back away, but he grabbed my shirt collar, shoving me flat onto the cold wooden floor. His hands clamped around my throat. His thumbs pressed into my windpipe, driving down with force like he meant to crush it. "You know something?" he said, his breath hot with alcohol and cheap mint mixing with desperation. "If you die of a heart attack in the cold, no one questions it. If you slip on ice, still an accident. You're old, Samuel. Old, weak, nobody cares." My sight began to blur, black spots expanding like holes in overheated glass. But in that exact moment, a memory flashed like a spark. Marianne's shotgun. She always said, "The mountains aren't just beautiful, they have teeth." I taught self-defense classes for older adults. I knew one technique that could save a life when someone was choking you. Use the attacker's weight against him. I gathered what little strength I had left, raised my knee, and drove my hips upward with everything in me. He lost balance, his hands slipping off my throat. I rolled to the side, coughing and gasping like someone dragged from underwater. My head spun, but my legs still worked, and I ran into the bedroom, my and Marianne's old room. I heard Darren curse and charge after me. I flicked on the small lamp. The locked cabinet stood in the corner. I opened the varnished lid. The key was still under the handkerchief Marianne had left years ago. I turned the key. The cabinet opened. Marianne's shotgun lay there, a Mossberg 500, the one she liked because it was light and easy to handle. I pulled it out, racked it. 2 buckshot shells sat in the box. I loaded them. Clack, clack. The sound echoed like a verdict. Darren froze in the doorway, his face drained from red to white. You won't shoot me." I raised the barrel, braced it against my shoulder, steady. "I don't need to shoot," I said, my voice rasping from being choked. "I just need to keep you here until the police arrive." He stepped back. I motioned. "Sit in the chair. Hands forward." In the lower drawer was a box of plastic zip ties. I used them to secure crates for transporting glass pieces. Strong, durable, and more reliable than tape. I dragged a chair to the center of the room. "Sit!" He had no choice. My fingers tightened the zip ties around his wrists, pulling hard, the sound slicing through the room. His hands trembled, his voice stuttering. "You'll regret this. Elena won't forgive you." I knelt, tying his ankles to the chair legs. "Elena will know the truth." He gave a weak laugh. "What truth? You're insane." I lifted the shotgun, placing the barrel close to his face. "The truth is, you just tried to kill me, and I have enough evidence to prove it." That was the moment he went silent, completely silent, for the first time since he entered my daughter's life. I was sitting on the wooden chair by the door, Marianne's shotgun resting across my lap, my eyes never leaving Darren tied tightly with zip ties, when the sound of an engine echoed from a distance, the sound of Elena's car. I recognized it instantly because for all those years, every time she visited me, I heard that exact sound on the stone road outside my studio. My heart tightened. I didn't want my daughter to see this, but I had no other choice. The cabin door swung open, cold air spilling in before Elena stepped inside. She froze, and in that moment, the entire room felt frozen with her. "Dad?" Her voice literally cracked. Her eyes moved across my face, bruised, my neck red with finger marks, then landed on Darren tied to the chair, hair disheveled, eyes wild with panic. The truth hit her like cold wind rushing through a crack in the door. She ran to me first. "Dad, what happened? Who did this?" I placed my hand on her shoulder. "Sit down, Elena. I need you to hear every word I'm about to say." I told her everything. The saw cut on the stair, the severed phone line, the USB, the forged insurance papers, the punch that broke my rib, which the moment I heard the crack I already suspected, his hand crushing my throat, and the sentence he hissed in my ear, "Nobody cares when an old man dies of a heart attack." The moment I finished, Elena covered her mouth as tears fell onto her own shirt. Then she turned to Darren, the man she had once vowed to, trusted and believed was her future. "You," her voice broke, "you were going to kill my father?" Darren shook his head wildly. No, it's not like that. You don't understand. I just panicked. I'm drowning in debt. I was scared of losing everything. I did it for our future, Elena. For our family." "What family?" Elena screamed, her voice sharp and shattering like overheated glass. "You just tried to kill my father, the only man who has protected me from the day I was born. What family are you talking about? What future begins with my father's blood?" Darren tried to struggle, the chair rattling, zip ties cutting into his wrists, leaving red marks. "Elena, listen to me. I only did it because I thought it was the only way." "The only way?" She let out a choked laugh. "Killing my father was your only way?" She turned to me, eyes red but clear, shedding every illusion she ever carried about this man. "Dad, we're leaving. I won't let him hurt you for even one more second." I stood up, wincing as pain flared along my rib. Elena reached to support me with the reflexes of a nurse who has saved countless patients. Before stepping out the door, she turned back to Darren, her gaze no longer loving, no longer hateful, just completely closed. "You thought my father was old and easy to kill?" she said slowly, each word falling onto the wooden floor like a weight. "You misjudged both of us." We stepped out of the cabin, snow settling lightly on Elena's hair. There was no signal on the road to town, so we had to drive almost 20 minutes before a bar of reception appeared. The moment she saw it, she dialed 911, her voice sharp and eerily calm. "This is Elena Pierce. I need to report an attempted murder. The victim is my father, Samuel Pierce. The attacker is my husband, Darren Holt. He's restrained safely. Address: Cedar Lake Cabin, Snoqualmie Pass." About 40 minutes later, when we returned to the cabin, the red and blue lights of Washington State Patrol streaked across the snow like cold lightning. 2 officers entered, surveyed the scene, photographed the evidence, and transported Darren to the station for questioning, but did not arrest him immediately because further investigation is required under procedure. When they removed the zip ties to replace them with temporary cuffs, Darren screamed, "Elena! Elena! You have to help me! You're my wife!" Elena stood upright, not shaking, not looking down. "Not anymore," she said softly enough that almost only I heard it. The police led Darren outside under investigative detainment, informing us he would be on supervised release while the case was completed. When the cabin door closed, the night wind slid through with a sound like glass shattering from far away. Elena turned and held me tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, I might disappear from this world. "Dad!" "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see." "It's not your fault," I said, placing my hand on her hair, the same place Marianne used to touch, whenever she soothed our daughter to sleep as a child. "You saw the truth, and you chose right." And in that moment, Surrounded by snow and police lights, I understood. Tonight wasn't only the night I survived. It was the night my daughter was freed from a life that was pulling her toward the cliff alongside the man who nearly killed me. Christmas dinner at Pierce Glass Studio was always shimmering like an old ritual. The glass lamps I made myself cast light down onto the oak table, reflecting bands of blue and gold across the faces of 12 people seated around it. This year the light was still beautiful, but my chest ached every time I breathed, the 3 broken ribs reminding me I had nearly died less than a week ago. Darren sat at the far end of the table, hair slicked, white shirt pressed, pretending to be a respectable man of the family. It was almost absurd to see the man who had almost killed me, sitting among lights and toasts, acting as if nothing had happened. Just as everyone raised their glasses, he stood, smiling so wide his gums showed. A toast to Samuel, still tough as steel after that fall at Cedar Lake Cabin. Looks like the old man finally learned his lesson. A few guests gave awkward laughs. Elena did not. She sat rigid, her hands clenched white under the table. I heard the faint ring of glass when I set my glass down, a cold, sharp ting that made the room pause. I stood up, even though every movement sent pain shooting through my ribs. "If there has to be a toast tonight," I said slowly, "I'd like to toast to truth having a place at this table." I opened the cloth bag by my feet and pulled out the first photo. The cabin stair with the saw cut slicing through 80% of the board, fresh sawdust, boot prints in the snow. The lamplight caught the image, making the cut line glow like a blade still hot. I passed the photo around the table. No one spoke. When it reached Elena, she looked at it for 1 second and turned away because she couldn't bear it. I took out the second photo. The cabin phone line cut cleanly and deliberately. This is why my daughter and I had to drive nearly 20 minutes just to call 911. Then I placed Darren's USB on the table. Inside this are the files I found in his bag. A foreclosure notice for $500,000, more than $300,000 in casino cash advances, and my insurance beneficiary change faked. All eyes turned to Darren, but he kept a thin, weak smile. "He went through my things. None of that proves anything." I lifted my sweater. The left side of my ribs was blue-green, as if someone had smeared paint across my skin, a large swelling from the intentional killing blow. The gallery owner exhaled sharply. The neighbor covered her mouth. I lowered my sweater and said only one sentence. "This is what was left after he rushed me intending to finish the job." Elena shot to her feet. "Enough!" She stared at Darren without blinking, eyes filled with pain and awakening. "You almost killed my father. I watched police take you from the cabin. What else could you possibly say?" Darren swallowed hard. He backed up a step. "Elena, you don't understand. I just panicked. You tried to kill my father," Elena cut in, her voice thin and hard like glass. "With that saw cut." She pointed at the first photo. "By cutting the phone line." She pointed at the second. "By leaving him to freeze in the cabin." She pointed at my chest. "And with that punch." The entire room went silent. No one moved. Only the glass lamps above trembled faintly, their reflections flickering on Darren's face like the last flare before extinguishing. Elena took a deep breath and said softly but firm, "I've filed for divorce. The court will send you papers soon." Darren opened his mouth but could not speak. He looked around the table, searching for someone to side with him. There was no one. "You chose that path," Elena added, "on your own." Right then, 3 loud knocks hit the door. The studio door opened, and the red-blue lights of Washington State Patrol spilled in like a cold blade. 3 officers stepped inside. "Darren Holt," one read out loud, "you are under arrest for the 2nd time under King County order. Attempted murder in the 1st degree, insurance fraud, forgery, tampering with a crime scene, and violation of release conditions." The whole table held its breath as the handcuffs clicked around Darren's wrists. He twisted back, screaming, "Elena, say something! You have to help me! You're my wife!" Elena shook her head, tears rising, but her voice steady as stone. No, I'm not your wife anymore. As they led Darren out, I saw reflected in the studio's glass door the face of a man stripped bare in front of his community, with no place left to hide, no lie left to cling to. And for the first time since the cabin, I let out a long breath. Not because I had won, but because the man who tried to bury me under the snow had been exposed under the very glass light I shaped with my own hands. A place where no lie can survive the heat of truth. After that Christmas night, everything moved faster than I expected. Only 3 days later, Darren was transferred to King County Jail while waiting for the official hearing on the charges. His public defender requested release again, but the judge took exactly 30 seconds to deny it. Violating release conditions and the violent evidence made him classified as a danger to the victim. From the moment the handcuffs tightened around Darren's wrists in my studio, he was no longer allowed to walk outside as a free man. The prosecutor sent me the draft indictment: attempted murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, forgery, tampering with a crime scene, and assault causing substantial bodily harm. Under Washington law, the projected sentence for those crimes combined falls between 12 to 18 years in prison. When I signed the final statement, I knew one thing. Darren Holt's life had ended on the very night he brought a saw to Cedar Lake Cabin. Elena filed for divorce right after Christmas. In Washington, the community property principle is very clear. All assets, all retirement accounts, all company shares of both spouses are split in half. But when one party commits a serious crime harming the other party or their parent, the judge has the authority to award the entire shared estate to the victim to remedy substantial injustice. Elena's attorney only needed to present a preliminary set of evidence, along with the arrest report from that night, before the judge looked at the file and struck the gavel. The entire marital estate belonged to Elena, including the funds Darren once bragged were for their future and a permanent no-contact order. As we stepped out of the courthouse, Elena stood beside me, the January Seattle wind blowing her hair. She did not cry. She only said one very soft sentence. I owe him nothing anymore. And I understood. That was true freedom. Cedar Lake Cabin, the place that nearly became my grave, I couldn't keep it. I had built that home with Marianne with my own hands and heart, had heard her laugh when snow fell on the porch, had watched her leave lipstick marks on the rim of her teacup every winter morning. But after the night Darren attacked, every wooden beam, every stair, every window carried a shadow. I listed the cabin for sale, and it took only 2 weeks to find a buyer. When the payment arrived in my account, I opened Marianne's old notebook, the one where she had written the names of cancer patients she wished she could help if she ever had the means. And I knew what I had to do. The proceeds from the cabin became the Marianne Pierce Healing Fund, a small but clean fund for cancer patients at Swedish Medical Center where Elena works. One circle closed, a home lost, a thread of light lit elsewhere. In the first days back at the glass studio on Lake Union, I still had to hold my side when bending down, because my ribs were not fully healed, and sometimes the pain ran from my chest to my stomach like a line of overheated glass. But I kept walking through the studio, touching each furnace, each mold rack, each pair of tongs, as if touching my life again. One cold morning, I lit the main furnace for the first time since before the Cedar Lake trip. The flame burst alive, reflecting amber orange on the window glass, then spreading into a warm red glow like a heart being awakened. I stood before that furnace for a long time. Fire does not judge. Fire does not lie. Fire only demands truth and real hands. I cleared a corner of my work table for the task I had delayed for 2 years since Marianne died, repairing the crack on her favorite sea blue glass vase. The crack was very small, almost invisible, but I knew where it was, right under the rim where she and I had held it together while it was still red hot in the last blowing session before her cancer diagnosis. I placed the vase in my palm, feeling the cold glass against my skin. Using the glass kintsugi technique I created, I heated the crack and used a gold-tinted glass rod to fuse it. The line glowed under the furnace light, turning into a thin stripe, like an afternoon beam stretching across a lake. As it cooled, I lifted the vase to my eye level. Not perfect, but beautiful. Beautiful in the way things that survive fractures are. Elena stopped by the studio that evening, carrying hot coffee and a slice of cake she knew I liked. She looked at the burning furnace and smiled. "I think you're back." I looked at the blue vase on the table. "No," I said. "I never left. I just lost my fire for a while." I turned back to the furnace, feeling the heat on my face. My ribs still hurt, but I was still standing. The furnace was still lit. Elena was still beside me, and the shadow of Darren Holt, though once overflowing with threat, was now only a faint shape behind the bars of King County Jail, where he will sit counting each day of a sentence lasting more than a decade. In a life of glass, I learned one lesson. What is overheated will crack, but what is heated right will shine. And after everything, I realized, a human life is the same. Spring returned to Lake Union as quietly as the breath of someone waking from a long, heavy sleep. The boats tied at the dock tapped gently against the wooden edge, leaving a steady sound like the ticking hands of a clock I've listened to my whole life. My glass studio was still there, with wide windows facing the water where the morning light angled in, painting shifting bands of color across the walls, sea blue, amber, pale pink, as if Marianne were blowing light back into the world from somewhere else. I opened the furnace door at 6 o'clock by old habit. The flame rose soft but steady, not fierce, not rushed, simply glowing like a loyal heart. The doctor still told me not to lift heavy things while my ribs weren't fully healed, but I knew how to stand right, how to let the heat soften the glass before touching it. The human body is sometimes like glass. It needs time to warm. Every Saturday, I ran a small class called Glass and Self-Defense for seniors, a combination that made everyone laugh at first, but then they all kept coming back. I taught them to balance, to turn their hips properly, to avoid falls that could break bones. Then I let them stand around the furnace to feel the heat, breathe the silicate smell, and try blowing a small bowl. Glass isn't as hard as people think, I told them. It just asks for focus, steady breaths, and a heart unafraid of fire. A 72-year-old woman once asked me, "Where did you learn that?" I looked into the flame and answered honestly, "From the things I survived." Near noon, Elena arrived carrying 2 coffees from the shop across the street. She opened the door, and the spring breeze mixed the smell of coffee with hot glass, creating a strange scent I never knew I would like. "Here, Dad, I picked the low-sugar one," she said, setting the cup down. I looked at her for a few seconds. The daughter, who months earlier sat hunched over in the driver's seat, crying because the man she loved most had tried to kill her father, was now standing tall, eyes clear and calm. Elena didn't need many words for me to see she had moved past Darren's shadow. She still went to therapy. She had moved into her own place, and on her face was something I hadn't seen in years, the light of someone who has reclaimed herself. "Was the studio busy today, Dad?" she asked, sitting in the chair Marianne used to sit in. "Just enough," I said. "There's an older gentleman who finally learned how to turn his hips to avoid falling. He'll beat me someday." Elena laughed. The sound traveled through the studio like a streak of light. She looked at the sea blue vase on my work table, Marianne's vase, the one I repaired with a thin gold line. "It's still my favorite," Elena said softly. "Mom used to put lilies in it." I nodded. "I didn't fix it to make it look new. I fixed it so its crack became part of its beauty." Elena touched the rim gently, her fingers trembling for a moment before settling. "I think you did the same thing with your life," she said. "Reheated it and made it shine again." I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the lake, the wind sliding across the surface, making ripples like freshly blown glass. From a distance, seagulls dipped and rose, their reflections trailing across the water like a reminder that everything has a way of returning. Are you afraid those things might come back someday? Elena asked, her voice quieter. I shook my head. No, I said, not because they disappeared, but because I faced them and blew my life back into shape. Elena nodded, her eyes a little red, not from pain, but from understanding. Time can weaken people, but it can also make them sharp, like glass tempered just right. When she stood to leave, she turned and said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. Dad, thank you for living. I placed my hand on her shoulder and pressed lightly. Thank you for giving me a reason to do it, I said. When she stepped out the door, I turned back to my work table and lifted the blue vase again. The gold line running along its body shimmered in the light, not hiding the crack, not erasing what once hurt it, making it the center of its beauty. I looked at it, then at my own hands, and finally I understood the lesson fire and time had been teaching me through a lifetime of glass. When glass cracks, we don't throw it away. We reheat it, reshape it, and give it a new form. People are the same. If you have stayed until the very end of this story, I want to tell you something I learned through cracked ribs, through the cold nights at Cedar Lake Cabin, and through the flame of the glass furnace at Lake Union. Not every fracture is an ending. Some fractures hurt us, make us believe we have already broken. But when we are brave enough to bring our lives close to the fire again, the fire of truth, of kindness, of the ones who stayed, those cracks will glow in their own way. I'm not telling this story to remind you of the man who almost killed me. I'm telling it to remind you of what I found again. A daughter stronger than fire, a studio risen from cooled ashes, and a belief that justice, even when late, always finds its moment to shine. If you are carrying a crack in your heart, trust me, it does not make you less. It is only waiting for the right flame to turn into a line of light. Thank you for giving your time to listen to this story from beginning to end. If what I lived through made you think differently about the strength of truth, or made you feel even a little less alone, leave a dot or a small note so I know where you are, what place you're hearing this story from. It truly means something to me. And if you want to keep walking with stories about fire, glass, and the people who refuse to let darkness define their lives, stay with me so I know you're still somewhere within my circle of light.